Heya Cryptozens, it's 10 p.m. Pacific time. My name is Nikodemus, and welcome back to the Crypto Overnighter, where we take a nightly look at the crypto, NFT, and metaverse space. And keep in mind, nothing in this show should ever be considered financial advice. It's 10 p.m. Pacific time. The date is November 30th, 2022. Let's see what's going on. How many times have you heard so-called experts predict the death of Bitcoin? Closing in on 15 years, and people are still eagerly predicting that Bitcoin is going to zero. How many times has the end of Bitcoin been predicted? A dozen? Wouldn't you think, after having failed so many times in a row, wouldn't they stop listening? I mean, if I heard a so-called expert just be wrong so many times, I would stop listening. Now, apparently, that's just me. Because it seems like people who are wrong get promoted to high office, or they get an investment show on CNBC. Ulrich Brinziel is the Director General of Market Infrastructure and Payments at the European Central Bank, which should be a warning sign right there, because while there are certainly exceptions, generally central bankers are horrible on the subject. And it looks like Ulrich is right there with him, along with his advisor, Jürgen Schaft. Now, they put out a blog post called Bitcoin's Last Stand. Do you consider it rude to call a central banker a liar? What if they're lying? Here, decide for yourself, because in that blog post, they said, quote, Bitcoin has never been used to any significant extent for legal, real-world transactions. So unless you want to argue for some distorted definition of the word significant, then it's clear that this is not true. You have to look no further than Bitcoin Beach at El Salvador to show Bitcoin being used every day in normal, legal, real-world transactions, including just picking up some fast food. Now, what they said was that Bitcoin was poorly suited for payments. They also said that because Bitcoin doesn't generate yield in terms of dividends and cash flows, that it's a poor investment. Both are untrue. In another tweet, they called the current price action in Bitcoin, quote, an artificially induced last gasp before the road to irrelevance. And they're dipping into the tired, failing Ponzi scheme argument. They're saying that the price is only good because it relies on new ways of getting fresh meat investors. They said, quote, big Bitcoin investors have the strongest incentives to keep the euphoria going. And these folks are warning that regulation is not the same thing as approval. They're not comfortable with the idea that crypto is just another type of investment. They finished off their little missive by calling Bitcoin, quote, an unprecedented polluter. They said that banks who promote Bitcoin will suffer reputational damage. Now, frankly, given the inaccuracies in their blog post, and given that Ulrich is a known CBDC supporter, this is clearly just propaganda. It stinks of fear, the fear of being replaced. Now, also in Europe, they're talking about MiCA, the Markets in Crypto Assets Law, and they're talking about FTX. Shortly after FTX collapsed on November 16th, we covered it on the show. Andre Kovarik said, quote, I don't see exactly how MiCA would be able to fully stop or prevent this. I can imagine that some aspects of it would be mitigated or alleviated. It would be too simple to just say that only crypto asset regulation would solve this. Now, Kovarik is a member of the European Parliament, but more importantly, he's a co-author in the bill. He wrote the thing. And on the topic of root causes, he said, quote, the real causes of the crash lie also somewhere else than what a crypto asset regulation can actually cover. Now, this is not a universal sentiment, at least not in the European Commission. Alexandra Schroeder is the Deputy Director General at the Commission in their financial services arm. And she was speaking to EU lawmakers at the European Parliament's Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee in Brussels when she said, quote, under the MiCA regime, no company providing crypto assets in the EU would have been allowed to be organized, or perhaps I should say disorganized, in the way FTX reportedly was. Now, I know that sounds bad for crypto, but really it's not. Because while she did say that the failing of FTX at critical tasks like record keeping and for the gross misuse of customer funds were potentially fraudulent, she told the members that she doesn't, quote, see them as failures of blockchain tech or even crypto assets per se. And, like the rest of the planet, the EU is keeping a close eye on what's going on with FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. That's not too surprising, really. 10% of FTX's customers were in the EU. And so that might be why some parliamentarians cannot see the simple truth of George Schroeder's words. They see what happened to FTX as indications of a far greater problem. Aurore Leluc is a French lawmaker. Well, she woke up today and chose violence because she decided to stir up a whole batch of FUD. She said, quote, "In the world of crypto, there are constant problems. Every day there is market manipulation and people who are embezzling. I'd like the commission to wake up a bit. Can we really hold our heads up high and say that Binance, for example, which is registered in Europe, couldn't possibly go bankrupt?" Stefan Kern is the head of the European Securities and Markets Authority, or ESMA, and he seems to be of a mind that while FTX is not a lone case of malfeasance on the part of crypto companies, but that means instead that FTX is a good starting point when considering future legislation. Quote, "I wouldn't comment on individual cases, but generally speaking, the industry has many signs of weakness across all key functions. MiCA, had it been in place, would have been extremely helpful." Now, Stefan Berger is the parliamentarian that shepherded MiCA through the legislative process. He also feels that MiCA would have helped in this case, and he also feels that the blame should lie with SBF. He compared FTX to the Lehman Brothers and said that the responsibility came down to Sam's behavior, not the technology. He said that MiCA needs to be passed as quickly as possible. He said it needs to, quote, "come into force so that in Europe we have rules which rule this type of situation out from the word go." And see, now we have to talk about something called reverse solicitation, because it appears that that would have been a loophole for FTX to continue operating. Here's what I mean. There are no rules against citizens of the EU going to offshore exchanges and buying all the crypto they want, no matter the limits on how much crypto you can buy and who you can buy it from. So MiCA requires any companies to register with local regulators, that is, if they want to do business in the EU. Now, this gives the EU opportunities to do things like check on the company's advertising and their governance to make sure that they're not lying to customers or misusing company funds. Now, the fact is that EU citizens could go to an offshore exchange, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Frankly, it's just not realistic to expect EU regulators to be able to enforce rules on overseas exchanges. Stefan Kern said that the reverse solicitation might be a substantial problem. He said, quote, "Service providers outside the EU play a dominant role in the crypto markets and should be expected to do so." So what do you do when you're in a situation like that? What it looks like the European Commission is looking for is to get other nations on board with those same regulations. George Schroeder spoke about this a bit. Now, she points out that crypto markets are connected and global. She also pointed out that when China clamped down legally on the ownership of crypto, that didn't actually stop anybody from buying it. Well, it appears to be her stance that unilateral regulation in this way would be ineffective. She said, quote, "We have to be vigilant that our EU protections are not undermined by jurisdictions that ultimately fail to regulate and supervise their companies," which is a pretty sharp rebuke to be leveling at the Bahamas. But here's a question, though. DeFi really comes to mind here. What do you do about companies who don't really have a home, or they're domiciled in places like the Bahamas and Dubai, where the EU has no reach at all? Michiel Hoogvegen is a Dutch lawmaker, and after Wednesday's hearing, he said, quote, "Companies physically present in the EU targeting EU consumers have to adhere to all the principles, rules, and regulations. There's a disbalance and a loophole." So all this tells me that while MiCA would have stopped FTX if FTX were based in the EU, those rules would not have applied to FTX as is, because they were completely outside the EU's jurisdiction. And while MiCA has been agreed to in principle, the expansive and technical nature of the text of the law has caused it to be delayed. In the EU, each law needs to be translated into the native tongue of all the member nations. Well, it seems that the translation is taking longer than expected, And so MiCA is due to go into effect in 2024 if it survives a final vote in February. And I want to close things out by going from the EU to Brazil, because they've actually got some good news for us today. They got one step closer because they passed a law that legalizes crypto payments throughout the land. And so it was that the Deputy of Chambers passed a regulatory framework. This framework legalizes crypto as a payment source, which represents a huge milestone, but still needs the signature of Brazil's president to become law. Now, just so there's no mistake, this doesn't mean that any cryptocurrencies are legal tender. And in fact, the law lumps digital currencies in with airline miles in the definition of payment types that are supervised by Brazil's central bank. And to be clear, this has no bearing on securities. Tokenized securities still fall under the authority of the Brazilian Securities and Exchange Commission. If this law is passed, then it falls to the executive branch to determine who will be responsible for supervising non-security crypto. And speaking more broadly, while this law does not grant legal tender status, it does lay out the creation of licenses for crypto exchanges as well as management and custodian services by third parties. And as a nod to FTX, the law requires exchanges to draw a sharp line between company funds and customer funds. Now, from the Brazilian regulatory space, let's go to the Futures Industry Association Asia Derivatives in Singapore. Because today, at that conference, U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission Commissioner Christy Goldsmith Romero was speaking on the subject of using technology to protect investors. And so she talked about a couple of proposals specifically meant to protect consumers as well as the markets. And she started off with definitions. She said, quote, protecting household retail investors start with defining who is a retail investor. And she went in to give some stats of the average retail crypto investor. Quote, most are young, born after 1980, diverse, and make less than $50,000 a year. That is not the typical customer that the CFTC is used to seeing. Now, the reason to point out that they're not the typical CFTC customer is because they should not be treated the same. She insists that it is the CFTC's place to make sure that they're not crushed due to a lack of targeted consumer protections. Now, what she's talking about is breaking retail investors out into two categories. You've got your regular run-of-the-mill retail investor. That's going to be different from your professional high-end net worth traders. And so she talked about how the CFTC could provide different protections based on the category that that individual falls in. Now, if we were talking about traditional finance, that would fall to the role of the broker to determine if an investment is appropriate for a specific consumer. We don't have that here. So it's Romero's point of view that it becomes the responsibility of the regulators. She said, quote, today I am calling publicly for the first time for the CFTC to invoke heightened supervision of crypto exchanges. It is well within our existing authority for derivatives exchanges. And so it came to pass that she did indeed endorse her fellow Commissioner Caroline Pham's idea, that of the creation of the Office of Retail Investor Advocate. And that's going to do it for us tonight. I want to thank you, my listeners, because when you stop listening, I will stop talking. We'll see you tomorrow night.